With this, I'll rid the world of infestation. Sans lingua franca, the world will be torn asunder, and then it shall be free.
The main villain of this game is a character called Skullface. And I think he's Hungarian born.
That's right, he was, yeah.
Yeah. And was kind of there when the Nazis kind of occupied Hungary. And so he kind of lost his native language as a kid. And I think just as he kind of got older, just kind of really despised that fact that he lost his native tongue. He discovers this parasite which can target people's vocal cords. And he works with a Native American character called Old Dene, who I learned doing research that the Dene is the genuine name for what's referred to as the Navajo.
Oh, okay.
People.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, and he was like, I was like doing research, and I was like, oh, I had no idea. So he kind of works with this character, and they kind of had this plan to engineer this vocal parasite to target English-speaking people. And essentially kill them if it detects people speaking English.
It's a very interesting narrative, tool. It's an interesting. I mean, it's interesting to come up with that as a concept because it seems so far-fetched.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
It's quite interesting because it helps tell a story and pick out some pretty interesting themes, which we'll talk about. But
the kind of impact it had on me was it's kind of made me think about things that I'd never really considered before. Obviously I'm English, was born in England. Obviously you're American, but your main language is English as well. And it just kind of made me realize that I've never really thought about the impact. Obviously, we learn about imperialism and colonialism, and which is horrific. But I'd never really thought about taking away someone's language and what that does to someone. Just never thought about that because I've never had to experience that.
No, exactly. We, as you say, are privileged by the sense that we were born and raised to speak what is essentially the lingua franca of the world, English, the common, the general language, which is such a silly concept as it is because there shouldn't be. I mean, humanity is incredibly diverse, and we live on all these different continents, millions and well, not millions, but thousands of miles away from each other. It doesn't even logically make sense to but obviously. Also, it's kind of interesting coming from acknowledging the fact that this was made from a Japanese company, and Japan's obviously the only country that will speak Japanese, whereas obviously there's multiple English-speaking countries. But Japan has a history, like England has a history, of trying to force their language onto other people or suppress local languages, indigenous languages, not necessarily even outside of modern day Japan. We can talk about it, but they do it in their own country because they, Hokkaido, the big island in the north, one of the big four, the northernmost one. Pokemon fans, you might know it as Sinnoh or Hisui, but that island is essentially, it was not indigenously at first. It was inhabited by Ainu people, I think, if I pronounced that correctly. Wow. And the Japanese obviously settled and suppressed that shit.
Right. Wow. I never knew that.
So it's quite interesting that this game is being made. It actually was made entirely in English.
Yes.
And then localized for Japan, which is really weird because it's a Japanese company. But it's funny that this story is being told by people by societies rather who
have a history.
Did this stuff rather than from the point of view of somebody who's had this done to them. Although, mind you, there's very few of the, there's not a lot. There's reasons, and we could talk about that.
Sure.
But
no, that's a really interesting point. I didn't think about that because you kind of raised that this game, unlike previous Metal Gear games, which are normally developed in Japan, where the facial animations are what do you call it, like synced up to the Japanese speakers. It was completely flipped for Metal Gear Solid 5. A massive and big controversial decision that was made with the 5th one was that they fired David Hayter.
Yeah.
Who's obviously like the most really iconic voice actor of the series. And they hired Kiefer Sutherland to play the voice of Snake. It was really, and because they were implementing facial capture technology in this game, they had I'm not sure if he flew over to Japan or they flew to the US, but regardless, he was the guy doing the facial expressions. And so it's quite interesting that the game that's all about the English language kind of taking over, even in its development, that kind of happened. And I think Metal Gear is a pretty big series in Japan, but
definitely, but
it was almost, this game was designed to cater towards Western audiences a lot more. So it's kind of, there's a kind of irony there that
there's definitely an irony there. Yeah, it's an interesting concept, the concept of language.
Yeah, because so I mentioned this character called Old Dene, who his code name, he also goes by Code Talker.
Right.
And this is another thing that I learned kind of while playing this game more, but also when I was researching it, I was like reminded of this, that during World War II, there was Dene people who were used to create code for US communications, and they were known as the Code Talkers. This character, he wasn't actually a code talker, but he helped make the language a bit more cryptic, so it was harder to break, essentially.
I was going to ask you if that was like a design thing, because when I was reading up on this, and I or when you first mentioned him, and that he's Dene or Navajo, I thought immediately, oh, okay, that's it's quite common knowledge in America that we use Navajo to code break, because I think it's, I don't think it was always this way, but I think due to U.S. cultural genocide, it is like it's a linguistic isolate, in the sense that I don't think it has any relative languages.
Yeah,
so,
right, okay.
So I think, I mean, I don't know the whole background, but I think that was the reason it was chosen.
Yeah, okay, I imagine so, yeah. And the history of this character it's really sad as well, and you can totally see why he comes to hate the English language. And when I was researching this and reading about his past, I was kind of thinking, this is something that's definitely happened in history as well, and you might have some examples, but he was put into like an quotation marks American Indian boarding school.
That's what they called them. Yeah, that was I mean, it wasn't just America. I mean, it was the United States, it was Canada. They had similar things going on in all other parts of the world, of course, but in Australia and whatnot. And it's generally, it was we could talk about it in more detail, but it was essentially an effort to exterminate a people without physically, I mean, they did plenty of that, plenty of physically exterminating people in what we would call genocide today. But another effort was assimilation, and that's I think that a better way to kind of conceptualize that, because that seems a bit not necessarily bad, but if you think about it, more of a cultural genocide. Often what was happening in these schools is they would take indigenous children from their families, from their communities, put them into these boarding schools where they were basically prisoners, essentially. They weren't allowed to speak their native tongue. They would be beat or harmed in other ways if they did dare to speak to each other in their native tongue, their mother tongue. And the idea was that, if you completely eradicate that language from them, you'll be able to separate them entirely from that culture to the point where the culture no longer exists. Because there's a reason they were doing it to children. It wasn't they weren't doing it. They were quite content to just kill the adults, to isolate them on what they called reservations, as if it was a fucking zoo, and just to leave them there to rot, basically. Land that's not worth anything commercially, land that can't sustain a growing population. That's the key thing, is the reservations don't grow in size. So you only have, if you give someone 100 acres or whatever, even 100 square miles, and you say, this is where you guys get to live for the rest of eternity, you can't grow on that, can you? No, you can only...
Population grows.
Yeah. So there's a reason they were stealing children, is because they wanted to steal the future of that culture, right? We pass on our culture in so many different ways, and it's not just, it's not just language. That's a big part of it. Because there's so much that is intangible. The way that the brain gets mapped, the way that you conceptualize like your physical surroundings through the medium of language, all of that is intangible, really. But that is one of the key aspects we pass that around. It's quite interesting that they targeted English in this game, because obviously it is the biggest, not the biggest language, but it's the biggest international language. It's the one spoken by most countries, in the sense that not even just English speaking countries. I'm not even talking about like US, Britain, Canada, whatever. I'm also, there's loads of countries whose native languages aren't English, but do speak English, and there's a particular reason for that. There's a particular reason, and this game really does get at it. But there's a particular reason why that English, Spanish, French, Portuguese even are spoken by hundreds of millions of people around the world, and it's not natural. It's not. It's not like, it's not just like the standard way that the world's going to develop. There's no givens in human development, to be honest. But well, maybe that's controversial. Some people would say there is, and maybe there are some paths, but in terms of language, there's no givens. Why is it that a very weird English is a very strange language, to be honest. It's a very interesting history. Obviously ties to the old Anglo-Saxon speech, merged with the Norman French, merged with the Danes and the Norsemen who came and invaded northern England, with bits of Latin as well. It's a very mixed language, spoken at the time by maybe a couple million people on a very wet, damp rock on the edge of the known world. Literally, how did this become a language of a billion people? It was entirely through colonialism and imperialism. So and that entailed just not just the spreading of people and like subtler colonialism in the sense that we might know it in the sense that people settled not uninhabited land, but land in America, in North America, in Australia and in South Africa, and spread their language that way. That is one way they did that, but also through colonial policy. So in places where, for example, Britain or America didn't physically colonize, in the sense they didn't send people to settle there, like much of Africa that Britain and when I say Britain, you can also include France and a whole host of people.
Western Europe.
Basically would go, and they didn't often settle these countries. They just took them over. They militarily took them over to take control of the resources, to extract those resources, and to open markets for the shit that they were producing in their home countries. So as part of doing that formal imperialism, formally taking over a country, you rewrite its laws, right? So you codify different laws, and how are you going to do that? You do that in the language you speak. So you might take over a country that speaks Zulu, but you're not going to write laws for them in Zulu. You're going to write them in English. So language, that is a tool. Like the English language, the Spanish language, the French language, the Portuguese language, they were used as tools to aid in the colonization and imperialism in general. And it helped to facilitate that. And this game obviously talks about, and we did talk about the cultural genocide of physically putting indigenous people into schools, where you denied them the access to their language, to their culture, and denied them the ability to not just learn, because often the kids were taken at a very young age as well. So some of them did not necessarily have time to acquire their native language. But it is a tool that's been happening all over the world by imperialist powers. Mostly, yes, Western Europe, because they are, the ones that started it. Japan has a history of it as well. But you get this system that's happening all over the world, where you can no longer speak Mayan, you have to speak Spanish. You can no longer speak Sioux, you have to speak English. You can no longer speak, name an indigenous language that in a country that was well, first of all, name a country that was colonized or ruled through some Western imperialism or Japanese imperialism, and find an example where they did not suppress the native language. That you won't find one. I'm sorry, you genuinely won't find one.
It's not gonna happen.
And that the point is, it is an aspect of power and control. When you deny people access to, and I think there's a quote at the start of the game. I don't even have the quote to hand, but it's something like,
I've got it
that
here.
we're not. Can you read it? If you have it?
It is no nation that we inhabit, but a language. Make no mistake, our native tongue is our true fatherland.
And then I don't believe that this is 100% true, but it does get at an interesting point, and that is, so much of our culture and our national identity is tied up into our language. So if you are a colonized person, right, or colonized people, and you're denied access to your culture by various other means, but also your language, it's really difficult to then continue to foster and build a national sense of identity within a colonial power. So it's definitely possible, and it is happening. I'm not saying it's not happening. It's happening in the U.S. It's happening in Canada. Anywhere where there's specifically, most of the anti-colonial struggles are happening in settler colonials at the minute, because but First Nations people in Canada, Indigenous people in America, in Australia, they might not. Some of them do. Some tribes and some peoples are still able to speak their language. They've recreated it if it was completely extinct. There's a lot of effort to preserve them that aren't extinct but are incredibly endangered. There's a lot of work being done to do that. But even nations who do not still speak their native language. They speak English. They still are fostering that sense of cultural identity, but it is hindered by being that disconnect, and that was an intentional choice. That was an intentional choice by whatever power was colonizing that particular people. That was a choice because they knew that it was an aspect to control them, not just now, but for time to come as well. For time to come.
It's a real just the whole theme in general is a really interesting one to dive into, and I'm kind of glad that we did. I'm glad that Metal Gear Solid gave us that opportunity.
This is it. It's a great series, and I think you're right when you said at the beginning of the episode, or towards the beginning of the episode, that one of the things you really enjoy about this series is, yes, there's common themes across all of it, but each of them seem to dive into a particular theme. And this is, when you said you wanted to talk about this one, I didn't know much about it at the time. But when I started watching some things and reading some things, I was like, okay, there's a lot here. Games, like any other form of media, are telling a story, and you can't tell a story that is completely detached from our reality. And I think Kojima made actually quite a lot of effort to tell a story that is attached to our reality. Yes, he's taken some liberties with certain things like parasites and whatever, but it's clear that I don't he would never have talked about some of these things or created some of these characters if he didn't actually know the history of of America, of imperialism in general, and it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
That's what I love about video games. I love being able to analyze them and think about, how does this relate to our world, because they do so often relate to our world, and they tell us stories that help actually almost in ways I think it's not a replacement for learning our true history. You need to learn our history, but
just gets you thinking.
Also gets you thinking, and to kind of introduce you to the concepts, because when you as you say, we don't really get taught everything when we grow up, and that's an intentional choice. But but it also, when we are taught, it's like, okay, all these people were did bad things to all these other people way before I was alive, even though I dispute that. So what's it got to do with me? But then, sadly for some people, it might actually help to have this character, the code breaker. They might be like, oh shit, okay, yes, this is actually real. Then it's become real. Like, this is actually something that happened. This is not an isolated thing. These people were put through hell for no other reason than they dared to have a different identity.